Now, we've been going through the book of Revelation, and in chapter 4 and 5, we saw that John sees a vision of heaven, where he sees worship going on, and the slain Lamb of God, Jesus Christ, he comes and he takes the scroll that's in the right hand of God the Father. And this scroll is sealed with 7 seals. And we saw the significance of this scroll. Now, when Jesus starts to unlock each of these seals, when he starts to open each of these seals, there's going to be a certain judgment that's going to be released on this earth. And when the 7th seal is opened, there's going to lead to another set of 7 judgments. Now, before we go into these judgments that we call as the 7-year tribulation period, let's go back into the Old Testament and see a little bit of history of how this fits into the biblical timeline, and why this week is so significant, and why this week is very important, and how the church age fits into the age of the Gentiles. Now, in Luke chapter 21, we saw that Jesus said, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that the time of her desolation is near. And the Jews will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now, Jesus says here that the age of the Gentiles will come to an end. But we also know that right after the cross, the age of the church began, the church age began, and it's still continuing. In other words, the church age overlaps the age of the Gentile. But the church age will come to an end when Christ comes again in the clouds. He was not going to come all the way down to the earth, just in the clouds, and he's going to take away the Christian believers to be with him. Now, this will be before the mark of the 7-year period. We will look into that in a minute. And chapter 4 and 5 of Revelation tells us that the church is in heaven along with the Holy Spirit, where they're offering worship to God, thanking him for what he's done for us and redeeming us through his blood. And in order to understand the age of the Gentiles, we saw the beginning of it when King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, comes and takes over Israel. And we saw this verse that Jesus says that Jerusalem will lay desolate, it will fall by the edge of the sword, and the Jews will be led captive. All this started happening when King Nebuchadnezzar took over Israel and Jerusalem as well. And Daniel, he sees a vision. King Nebuchadnezzar also has a dream in which the king sees himself as a high and mighty statue with a head of gold, arms and breast of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, and legs of iron, and then feet partly of clay mixed with iron. And then later on in chapter 7, Daniel also sees a vision which could be parallel to what King Nebuchadnezzar saw. He sees 4 beasts. He sees the lion with wings of an eagle. Then he sees a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. And then he sees a 4-headed leopard, followed by a beast that he's not able to describe. But then in Daniel 7, we also see that he sees 10 horns, and an 11th horn that pops up. Now, Daniel is still in exile. The Babylonians have ruled for almost 70 years, and he finds himself reading from the book of Jeremiah. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 1, he says, "In the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Now, Daniel finds himself in the next part of the statue, or in the next part of his dream. So it starts with the head of gold, which was the Babylonian kingdom, as we saw, and the next part is the Medo-Persian rule, which is the arms and chest of silver, or the bear. So here he finds himself in this, and he's reading, and he says the 70 years of desolation has been determined for the people of Israel. And so now he's almost 67, 68 years into this exile, and he's reading from his contemporary, Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11, this is probably what he would have read. It says, "This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then it'll be when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation." So in one way, God is the one who allows Nebuchadnezzar to gain power. We saw that. And here he says that I am the one who also will punish the king of Babylon, which also happened. But there's something else here. He says, for 70 years the land will lay desolate. See, back when God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, he gave them the commandments when they were in the wilderness, and he gave them a set of rules, and he said these are conditional blessings and you need to follow them. And if you break this covenant, if you break this commandment and disobey me, I will bring judgment upon you. Look in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 14. God's giving them instructions, and he says, "If you do not obey me and do not carry out all these commandments, if instead you reject my statutes, and if your soul abhors my ordinances, so as not to carry out all my commandments, and so break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you." And he goes on to list a bunch of things that he's going to do. And in verse 33 he says, "You, however, I will scatter you among the nations, and will draw out a sword after you, as your land becomes desolate and your cities become waste. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of desolation, while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land will lay rest and enjoy its Sabbaths." So here's what's happening. God had given instructions to the Israelites saying that they could plow the land that they're in for 6 years. And on the 7th year, the land was to lay fallow for the good of the land. This principle is actually something that true Jewish farmers follow to this day. And so he says, in turn, on the 6th year, I will give you a double portion of harvest so that you don't have to farm on the 7th year. It's the year of Sabbath. It's called the land Sabbath. But what had happened was, through the years, the people of Israel, they neglected this command and they started farming the 6th year. They kept the double portion and they continued farming in the 7th year as well. And they kept going, so the land never got its land Sabbath. The land never got its rest. And so this went on for 490 years. So if you do the math, that adds up to 70 years of land Sabbath. And so now here Daniel is reading Jeremiah 25 saying that the years of desolation will be 70 years. And also in Leviticus 26 verse 35, God says, "All the days of its desolation it will observe the rest, which it did not observe on your Sabbaths while you were living on it." So Daniel sees these verses and he starts repenting and interceding on behalf of his nation and his people. In Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 3, that's what he starts doing. He starts asking God for forgiveness, hoping that God would restore the people back. Now this does happen. Cyrus of Persia, back in 538 BC, he does release the people to go. But if you look at the timeline of Daniel himself, the Medo-Persian rule should be followed by the Greek rule, the belly and thighs of bronze, or the four-headed leopard. So that should happen. But Daniel here is praying, asking God to keep his covenant that he made with Abraham, that he will give them a king, an everlasting king. Now we're going to see in the spiritual sense that it is going to happen when Christ comes and he reigns forever. So Daniel starts praying and interceding for this. And but like I said, you need to understand that the timeline doesn't match. Because the end of the age of the Gentiles will happen when there is the 10 toes mixed of iron and clay, or the vicious beast with the 10 horns. When that happens, and then a rock comes out of heaven, an uncut rock comes out of heaven, and it crashes the statue to smithereens. That's when the end of the age of the Gentiles will happen. So as he's praying, God sends Gabriel, the angel, to start explaining to Daniel what exactly needs to happen. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. There's a lot to unpack in this passage right here. Verse 24, it says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. Now this part, it says weeks. It comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means a set of 7. So 70 times 7, 490. Now even still, we cannot take this as literal 490 weeks or even 490 months. The only way the events that follow after this fits in the historical periodical timeline is if we take this as years. So 490 years has been set aside. It's a unit of 7, right? So 490 years has been decreed for your people and your holy city. Verse 25, so you are to know and discern from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Let's understand the timeline here a little bit. Okay, in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes over Israel, the king of Babylon. Daniel is taken captive during that time. Almost 67 years or 68 years later, Daniel is in the first year of King Darius. And so he's figuring out that this 70-year period that he just read about in Jeremiah is coming to an end, and he's making the prayer in Daniel chapter 9. Now, about a year later, in 538 BC, Cyrus does release the people to go back and rebuild the temple. We read about this in Ezra chapter 1. But in verse 25, it clearly says, discern the timing that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, not the temple, Jerusalem. Now that comes in Nehemiah chapter 2, 445 BC. King Artaxerxes allows Nehemiah to go back to rebuild the city. Back in Daniel, from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Messiah the Prince, we know that this is Jesus Christ. In fact, this is the first time in the Old Testament that he's referred to as the Messiah. He's known as other things. Even in Genesis, God called him the seed of the woman. Moses said there will be another prophet like me. But here it says the Messiah, the Prince. So it's very, very specific. And it says, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, there's going to be 7 weeks. That is 7 times 7, 49. And we know that a week is a year. So 49 years. And 62 weeks. That is 434 years. So 49 and 434 makes 483 years from the point that the issue went out to build Jerusalem, to rebuild Jerusalem, to when Messiah the Prince will be cut off. So if you do the math, so Robert Anderson actually did the math, and he calculated that 483 years from this point, 445 BC, if you calculate, it comes to the exact time that Jesus comes riding in on a donkey into the city of Jerusalem. And we know Jesus said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you have missed the time of your visitation. So it's very precise. This prophecy is very precise, and that's one of the reasons many skeptics don't like the book of Daniel, because it's very accurate. But here's the thing. We started off by saying that there's 490 years. And now there's 483 years. The Messiah, the Prince, Jesus Christ, comes riding on a donkey. And this verse says that he will be cut off or crucified, which happened a week from the triumphal entry. Jesus does get crucified. So there's still 7 years that are still yet to happen. 490 years. Where does that fit in? Soon after the triumphal entry, the disciples are walking with Jesus and they're showing him the massive temple, the structures, because Herod was adding on to Solomon's temple that was rebuilt, and it was so big and so magnificent that the temple actually wasn't finished even 40 years after Christ. But then it was the Romans themselves that came and destroyed it in 70 AD. So now Jesus looks at these temples and he says, do not be alarmed, do not be marveled by this, because this is going to be destroyed and not one stone is going to be left on top of the other. Obviously, he's referring to the attack that's coming in 70 AD. And so the disciples, I don't know if they knew the timeline that Daniel gave, but maybe they're assuming that this is when Christ is going to bring in his kingdom. And so they catch up with him later that day, and they're on the Mount of Olives, which is famously known as the Olivet Discourse. We find this in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. And they come up and they ask him this question. Matthew 24, verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, you have to understand that what was going on through these disciples' minds, they are thinking that Christ is going to bring in his reign right now, because that's what they have been expecting. The whole Jewish community has been waiting for a Messiah, a Lion of Judah, to come riding in and overthrow the Roman government. In Luke 21, verse 7, they questioned him, saying, teacher, when therefore will these things happen, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So they're saying, when will these things take place? What are the sign of your coming? And what are the signs of the end of the age? So they're more eager to find out. But the way Jesus answers it tells us that this 7-year period that we're waiting for is still yet future. It's still about to come. And so Jesus answers this question by saying what is not the end of the age. He says there will be certain signs, but do not be alarmed, that is not the end of the age. Look at this in verse 8. And he said, see to it that you are not misled, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Matthew 24, and Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. And you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For a nation will rise against nation, and a kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Now in birth pangs, you know that the contractions start to happen, and sometimes it could be a long time before it becomes more frequent. And it starts repeating itself, and only then will they take you into the labor ward. And so here Jesus says, now the signs are, there will be people coming in my name, there will be wars, and that's been happening. Even during the time of Christ, there were other people claiming to be the Messiah. There were things happening even back then. So God is saying when it becomes more frequent, He says, nation will turn against nation. World wars. We already saw 2 world wars. In the First World War, only about 80% of the world got involved. In the Second World War, 95% of the world got involved, they say. So it got worse. It got worse. 60 million deaths in the Second World War compared to 17 million. So it becomes more frequent. When it becomes more closer together, that's when you know the end is near. Increased famine. There are famines happening in places that you will not expect famine to happen. Food and people going hungry. When I say famine, it's not always just drought. People going hungry and dying of starvation, even in advanced countries. And earthquakes happening all over the world. In verse 21, he says, for there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world, until now or ever will. Now, this tribulation that Jesus is talking about is not the regular trials and tribulations that we go through every day. This is going to be something that the world has not seen. Something that has not happened from the beginning of the world till now. And as we read through Revelation, starting in chapter 6 all the way down to 18, that's what we're going to see. And so this is what makes us understand that this 7-year period is yet future. This 7-year tribulation, this great tribulation that Christ is talking about, is yet to come. It's yet to come. And I believe, strongly believe, that it will happen after the rapture of the church. After the rapture of the church. Also, back in Daniel chapter 9, he gives us more. In verse 26, he says, then after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and his end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined, and he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now if you look in this passage, this is talking about another prince, a prince of the people. In verse 27. In verse 25 we saw the Messiah, the prince. In most English Bibles it will have an uppercase P and a lowercase p for this prince. And so this prince, this little horn, has not appeared yet. Remember back in the timeline of Daniel, in chapter 7, he sees these 4 beasts, and the 4th beast is vicious. It's 10 horns on its head, and 3 of them are plucked out, and 11th horn pops up. Daniel is so taken up by this vision, he's kind of freaked out about it, that he asks the angel to explain it. And the angel starts explaining in verse 23, the 4th beast will be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth, and tread it down, and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the Highest One, and he will make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. So according to the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, the Roman kingdom, the legs of iron, it's kind of divided east and west. And then the Roman kingdom kind of, it's spread out, into different parts of the world. But then somehow they come together in a very unlikely alliance. The 10 toes mixed of iron and clay. Here we see 10 horns. And they come together, these 10 kings. And that marks the beginning of the end of the age of the Gentiles, because soon after that the uncut rock comes out of heaven and smashes them. And here it says in Daniel 9:27, he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, and in the middle of the week he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offerings. So the beginning of this firm covenant marks a 7-year period, the 7-day week. Right? We saw that already, that a week means 7 years. But it also shows that the temple will be rebuilt. Because by the time John was writing this, he was in exile in Patmos, and the temple had already been destroyed in 70 AD. And so there will be a third temple, because it says here, he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering. To do that, they need a temple. So this person, this prince, this 11th horn, this son of perdition, this antichrist, he would have built the third temple for them. So this treaty that he makes, this firm covenant that he makes with the people, I think it is the covenant that he makes with the people of Israel by rebuilding the temple for them. But in the middle of that 7-year period, this 11th horn is going to put an end to it. Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, at the 3.5-year period, which we call the mid-tribulation, we'll study more about that in the coming lessons, the Antichrist will claim to be God, and he will put an end to the sacrifices that the Jewish people are doing in the midst of this horrific time. So this 490 years still has 7 years left. And I think the 7 years will begin when we see the 10 kingdoms and the 11th horn popping up. But right before that, the rapture of the church needs to happen. Now, when will the rapture of the church happen? We're not sure. Even Jesus said no one knows the time or the date when that's going to happen, only the Father in heaven. So that we need to be ready for. As Christians, we need to be ready for when Christ comes again, the trumpet sounds, and we'll be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. And after that, we don't know for how much longer it'll be after that, the 7-year tribulation period begins when Jesus starts to unlock the 7 seals up in heaven. Now, this 7-year period, we've been calling it the 7-year period of tribulation. Most people call it the Great Tribulation Period. There are different names for it throughout the Bible. It's been mentioned many times. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 30, it's called the time of distress and tribulation. In Malachi chapter 4, it says it'll be a great and terrible day of the Lord. Even 1 Thessalonians and 2 Peter make a reference to that same phrase. It'll be a great and terrible day of the Lord. Daniel chapter 11 says it'll be a time of indignation. Isaiah chapter 34, it says it'll be a year of recompense and retribution for Zion. Zephaniah chapter 1 verse 15, it says, that day is a day of the outpouring of the wrath of God, the day of troubles and distress, a day of destruction and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Joel chapter 2 verse 1, and sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Now we have to understand that in prophecy, when it talks about a day of the Lord or a week, it usually refers to a time period. It's not necessarily a 24-hour day. So the day of the Lord is coming. That is a time of judgment is coming. Surely it is near. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, as the dawn is spread over the mountains. So there is a great and mighty people. There has never been anything like it, nor will there be again after it, to the years of many generations. Look at this in Jeremiah chapter 30. Alas, for that day is great. There is none like it, and it will be a time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. This verse helps us understand the main reason behind this 7-year tribulation that is yet to come. See, even the 490 years began because of Israel's disobedience. They failed to keep the covenant that God made with them back in Leviticus. And so God is going to keep that covenant with them. He's going to be dealing with Israel primarily and making amends for all the things that they missed. The church, as Christians, we come under the new covenant, and so the church is not subject to the laws of the old covenant. And I believe that is one of the reasons why the church will be raptured before this period begins. Here it also says that it will be a time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. It also goes to show that Israel and certain Jewish people will be saved from the time of tribulation. They will be spared by God. This 7-year period will also bring an end to the age of the Gentiles. It will bring an age to the end of the Gentiles when Jesus comes riding in on a white horse as a conquering king in Revelation 19. And the 6 points mentioned in Daniel chapter 9 verse 24 will be fulfilled. It says 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city. Number 1, to finish transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. All these things will happen. The iniquity will be completely ended. Transgression will completely finish. And to anoint the most holy place, in other words, to anoint Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, will happen at the end of the 7-year period, at the end of the age of the Gentiles. And we're going to see that in this 7-year period, Christ is going to he's going to use Satan and his demonic forces to fulfill his heavenly plan. That is to purge the earth before the millennial reign. But in turn, Satan himself will be punished, his demons will be judged, and they will be cast away. Back in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, it says, after the beast and everything, the Ancient of Days took his seat, the court sat, the books were opened, and I kept looking until the beast was slain, and his body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As the rest of the beasts, their dominions were taken away. Verse 26, but the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. This 7-year period is going to be a time where God renews the earth. And at the end of it, Christ will reign supreme. It was already prophesied in the book of Psalm chapter 2, verse 6. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. As for me, I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. Now, before Christ comes and sets up his throne here on this earth, he needs to clean house. He's going to have to purge this earth. And that is why he's going to allow the 7-year period. The 490 years are going to be complete. The age of the Gentiles is going to be complete. Think about the love of God for a minute. 483 years precisely from the time that the issue went out to rebuild Jerusalem, Christ comes in. He dies on a cross. And from that point on, the grace period begins. With his shed blood, he makes the way open for even Gentiles to come in. God puts that timeline on hold, and he starts focusing on the Gentiles, not just the Jews. And so he's focused on the rest of the world, when the rest of us, we get saved and we get to call on Christ. We get accepted by Christ, and we get a future in heaven with him. That when Christ comes again, we will be going with him in the rapture. All that happens. And after that, God is going to focus back on Israel for the next 7 years, and that's when this great tribulation period happens. So when we understand this, as we call the 70th week of Daniel, that is still yet to happen, when we understand why and when it's going to happen, it helps us understand the timeline that we see in Revelation. This 7-year period is not going to be fun. As it's called, it's going to be a time of great tribulation. Jesus said it's going to be something like the world has never seen. There will be people who will get saved during that time. We're going to see in chapter 7 and on. There will be people who will come to know the grace of God. But my question is, why wait till then? Why wait till then? Any time is a good time to call on Christ. If you haven't done so, say, God, I need you in my life. I surrender my life to you. I want to follow you as my Lord and Savior. And he's willing and gracious to accept anyone who calls on him, to forgive you of your sins. We're going to be looking at chapter 6 as Jesus unlocks the 7 seals and the judgment starts happening on this earth. So don't miss these videos. If you missed any of the old ones, I encourage you to go check it out. I hope these lessons are a blessing to you. I will see you next time.